It was an ancient night before the flood. The sky hung over the plains of Mesopotamia like a mantle of lead, and men slept confident in their tents, certain that the world belonged to them, certain that they had ruled the earth since the expulsion from the garden, certain that nothing could threaten the sovereignty of flesh. But something was moving among the stars. Something was descending, enormous shapes crossing the horizon, giant shadows marking the dust of villages, swords snapping in human hands like dry twigs, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through entire valleys, kings kneeling before creatures that could not fit inside any temple. And when the dust settled over the first centuries of humanity, all that remained was the terrifying silence of a land occupied by beings that should not have existed. They had names, they had lineage, they had a dark purpose that still echoes today in the most censored pages of the Bible, in manuscripts removed from the canon, in the whispers of ancient rabbis who refused to explain what they knew. The story of the Nephilim crossed 3,000 years of traditions, persecutions, and calculated silences, and the little that survived still unsettles those who allow themselves to open the book of Genesis and read chapter 6 without looking away. The passage is right there. Brief, brutal, undeniable. Just 4 verses in the 6th chapter of the most widely read book in history. And in 4 verses, the sacred author reveals one of the most disturbing episodes ever recorded in any religious scripture of the ancient world. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Sons of God, daughters of men, 2 distinct natures, 2 separate domains, and a transgression so grave that, according to the text itself, it awakened the judgment of the Creator. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Attention!
There is a truth sealed by God for millennia, hidden until the end of times. It's no coincidence you are here. The signs are everywhere, and few are ready for this revelation. If you've ever felt that restlessness, that there's something deeper in the scriptures, this book is your key. But know this is the time. And the vault of the chosen reveals what God sealed for you. Within it, the 7 seals unveil the truth about being a chosen one and the eternal impact of this revelation. And the proof is here. Look how many minds are freed. Yours could be next. Secure your access now. Click the link in the comments or description and unveil these truths.
Giants. The Hebrew word is Nephilim, and its literal meaning sends a chill even through those who master the language. The fallen ones, those who make others fall, those who descended. They were not ordinary men. They were not pure angels. They were the children of a forbidden union between heaven and flesh, hybrid creatures that walked among mortals for centuries before the great catastrophe that attempted to erase them from the map of the world. And here lies a truth that cuts across every civilization, every people, every era. The human being has always gazed at the sky with a mixture of reverence and longing, always desired to touch what lay beyond reach, always wanted to become greater than it was made to be. It is there in the myth of Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods. It is there in Icarus, burning his wings in the sun. It is there in the builder of the tower, who tore through the plain of Shinar, in the ambition to reach where mortals were never meant to tread. And when something from above descends to us, offering power, offering knowledge, offering the breaking of limits, a secret part of every human heart leans in, drawn forward, even knowing the price could be devastating. The men of those days were no different, and that is precisely why the story of the Nephilim had to be silenced. During the first centuries of Christianity, church fathers such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, and Athenagoras accepted without hesitation the oldest and most literal interpretation of the text. The sons of God mentioned in Genesis would have been the angels of heaven, and their unions with human women would have produced monstrous offspring, endowed with superhuman strength and destructive intelligence. It was the natural reading. It was the reading of the rabbis before Christ. It was the reading of the apostles themselves, as the letters of Peter and Jude make clear, both referring to angels who abandoned their original domain and were cast into prisons of darkness until the day of judgment. But something changed. Around the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, with the consolidation of imperial Christian power and the need for a clean, orderly, controllable theology, an alternative current emerged. Augustine of Hippo, brilliant and influential as few thinkers in history have been, proposed an entirely new reading. The sons of God would be merely the pious descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam, and the daughters of men would be the fallen lineage of Cain. No angels, no hybrids, no literal giants, just a moral metaphor about mixed marriages between the righteous and the wicked. It was a monumental theological turning point, and it was a convenient one. Convenient because it eliminated in a single stroke the uncomfortable possibility of celestial beings with their own will, capable of transgressing the domain assigned to them. Convenient because it fit more cleanly with the doctrine of angels as impassible and incorporeal beings. Convenient because it swept under the rug one of the most explosive sections of the Hebrew Scriptures, precisely at a time when the Church needed doctrinal unity, not uncontrollable mystery. The new interpretation won. It was taught in seminaries, it was repeated from pulpits, it was consolidated in catechisms. It crossed the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and arrived at contemporary Christianity as though it had always been the only possible reading. And the Nephilim, those giants born before the flood, were reduced to an allegorical curiosity, a figure of speech, a metaphor for the moral corruption of primitive humanity. But the text did not die. The text is right there in ancient Hebrew, written before any council existed, before any doctor of the church drew breath, before Rome had even laid its first walls. And the text says, without detour, that in those days there were giants in the earth. Not only before the flood, also after. Notice that detail. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Also after that. If the Nephilim were merely the result of moral marriages between the righteous and the wicked, how do we explain their continued presence after the flood, in a world freshly purified by the waters? If they were simple metaphors, why do they reappear as concrete physical threats in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, in Joshua, in Samuel? Why did the spies sent by Moses into Canaan return trembling, reporting men of such stature that they felt like grasshoppers beside them? The Augustinian reading solves one theological problem and creates a dozen others. That is why, across the centuries, there have always been scholars, mystics, commentators, and theologians who refuse to accept the silencing. They return to the Hebrew. They return to the rejected manuscripts. They return to the parallel accounts preserved in cultures that had never even had contact with the Bible, yet described with disturbing similarity the same event. Beings from above descending to earth, taking mortal women, generating a race of giants that terrorized the earliest peoples. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki. The Greeks spoke of the Titans and the giants. The Egyptians kept memory of the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who reigned before the human pharaohs. The Norse spoke of the Jotnar, primordial giants who contested with the gods for dominion over the earth. The accounts differed on the surface, but the core was the same, and all of them converged with unsettling unanimity on a single conclusion. There was a time when the earth was inhabited by creatures who were not born of men alone, And that convergence is what most troubles those who attempt to dismiss the biblical narrative as simple local myth. Because myth does not travel alone. Myth does not cross entire continents without cultural contact, telling essentially the same story with the same central elements in civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. When that happens, and it is precisely what happens with the Nephilim, something deeper is at stake. It may be ancestral memory. It may be shared revelation. It may be, as the ancients affirmed without the slightest embarrassment, the record of real events that occurred before the fall of the first known civilizations. And it is precisely that record which the Western tradition, especially after the 5th century of the Christian era, began to erase with method and patience. The manuscripts were removed from the canon. The alternative readings were declared heretical. The commentaries defending the literal interpretation were accused of naivety or of Gnostic contamination. And a curtain of silence fell over Genesis chapter 6, a curtain so heavy that still today most Christians pass over those verses without perceiving the magnitude of what is written there. But silence is never eternal. And what had been buried for centuries began, slowly to surface, pushed forward by archaeology, by philology, by discoveries in caves in the Judean desert, by forgotten translations in remote monasteries, by ancient texts that re-emerged into the sunlight after almost 2,000 years kept in the sand. The true story of the Nephilim, the one that the official tradition sought to conceal, was still waiting. And it begins even before the name of these giants is pronounced in any sacred scripture. It begins at a far more remote moment, in a decision made in the celestial places, in a transgression that forever altered the destiny of the human race, and that produced, centuries later, 3 different interpretations locked in fierce dispute over the meaning of who those beings really were that walked among us. The first of these interpretations is the oldest, the most widespread among the peoples of the ancient Middle East, and also the most disturbing for classical theology. It holds that the sons of God mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 were angelic beings, rebellious angels, celestial spirits who, observing the beauty of the women of the earth, abandoned the post entrusted to them in the high places and descended in pursuit of forbidden unions. From these unions were born the Nephilim, creatures who carried at once the breath of heaven and the clay of the earth, and who precisely because of that monstrous mixture belonged fully to neither of the two worlds. This reading, which sounds extravagant to modern ears, was practically unanimous among the Jews of the Second Temple period. It was the reading of the scribes who copied the manuscripts of Qumran. It was the reading of the earliest church fathers before the subsequent retreat. It was the reading assumed without disguise by authors such as Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Tertullian, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Clement of Alexandria. Men who lived 200-300 years from Christ, and who were therefore infinitely closer to the original sources than any commentator of the following millennium. And all of them said the same thing: the sons of God were angels, the Nephilim were hybrids, and the cataclysm that followed was the divine response to that contamination. The second interpretation, which would become official in Christian Western tradition, is later more cautious and in a certain sense more comfortable. It was born from the need to protect the doctrine of angels as purely spiritual beings, incapable of any carnal relationship. To sustain this theological requirement, the meaning of the expression was shifted. The sons of God would no longer be celestial creatures, but rather the pious descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam. The daughters of men, in turn, would be the corrupted descendants of Cain, the first murderer in history. The union between these two lineages, according to this reading, would have been a spiritually catastrophic union. The holy lineage mixing itself with the cursed lineage. The seed of blessing contaminated by the seed of the fall. And the Nephilim, in this model, would cease to be literal giants and become moral symbols. Powerful men, valiant men, but above all, corrupt men, whose wickedness filled the earth until it forced the hand of God to interrupt everything. It is an elegant interpretation. It resolves the problem of the angels. It maintains the integrity of pure spirits, and it reduces the monstrous to the moral, transforming a narrative of cosmic horror into an allegory of spiritual decadence. The problem is the same as always. The text resists. Because if the Nephilim were merely corrupted men, descendants of Cain, married to daughters of Seth, why would Moses, centuries later, describe the Anakim of Canaan as being literally descendants of the Nephilim? Why would he insist on the physical stature of these peoples? Why would he say in Deuteronomy that Og, king of Bashan, slept in a bed of iron of such colossal proportions that it had to be preserved as a public spectacle among the children of Ammon? One does not build oversized beds for moral allegories. One does not measure in cubits the bedframe of a metaphor. The third interpretation attempts a middle path and, in a certain sense, an even more earthbound one. It proposes that the sons of God would have been human kings, despots who proclaim themselves divine, tyrannical rulers of the ancient world who, in their arrogance, took common women for themselves as trophies, generating dynasties of violent men. The Nephilim, in this reading, would be feared warriors, brutal heroes of antiquity, but entirely human. This interpretation has the merit of anchoring the narrative in something politically verifiable, and the flaw of explaining very little, because it does not answer why that same race appears described in other texts of the same canon, with characteristics that are clearly supernatural. It does not explain why the Book of Enoch, cited by name by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament, devotes entire chapters to describing celestial beings who broke a sacred oath and descended to earth. It does not explain why that same tradition, with so many surface variations, resurfaces in Daniel, in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, every time the sacred text approaches the theme of the fallen angels. And it is precisely at this point that the Book of Enoch erupts into history as a document too uncomfortable to be ignored and too dangerous to be accepted without reservation. The Book of Enoch is ancient, far older than most people imagine. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, dated centuries before Christ. It was a revered text, read, copied, and studied by entire communities of devout Jews awaiting the coming of the Messiah. It was openly cited by the earliest Christians, and it offers, concerning the Nephilim, the most detailed account that survived from antiquity. According to Enoch, 200 were the angels who descended. They were called the Watchers, and the name of their leader was Semjaza. They descended upon Mount Hermon, swore a mutual oath of complicity in their transgression, and there sealed the covenant that would bind their condemnation. They took women from among the daughters of men, and they taught those women, and through them, all of humanity, knowledge that should never have been entrusted to them. It was thus, according to the account, that the forbidden arts spread across the earth. Azazel taught men to forge swords, taught them to fashion shields, breastplates, and instruments of war, taught women to paint their eyes, to color their faces, to bend precious stones into seductive ornaments. Other watchers taught sorceries. They taught the interpretation of the stars, taught the reading of signs in the clouds, in roots, in fire, taught, in short, everything that should never have left the celestial realm for the kingdom of mortals. And the result of those unions and those stolen revelations was a world disfigured. The Nephilim, according to Enoch, were colossi. They devoured what men planted. When the food ran out, they turned against the men themselves, then against the animals, and finally against one another's blood. The earth cried out, not in poetic metaphor, cried out literally, according to the text, under the weight of the violence poured upon its soil. And that cry rose to the celestial throne as a complaint that demanded an answer. It is at this precise point that the story ceases to be merely a report about the past and becomes a mirror, because any honest reader who walks through those pages will encounter two morally legitimate readings of the same episode, and neither of them is comfortable. On one side, it is possible to see the Watchers as traitors, creatures who abused their own freedom and dragged humanity into an abyss from which it has not yet fully risen. On the other, it is possible to see in those same figures an inverted tragedy, beings who gave to humanity the first instruments of civilization, iron, astronomy, the writing of signs, and were condemned for it. To determine which of the two faces is the true face of this story is to decide, at the same time, what is, at its very core, the price of knowledge. And that decision every reader makes inwardly, in silence, without anyone needing to teach them how. The celestial response, however, was swift and merciless. The archangels received their orders. Gabriel was sent to incite the giants against one another in the hope that they would annihilate each other. Raphael received the task of binding Azazel in a cleft of the desert, covering him in darkness until the day of judgment. Michael was sent to announce to Semjaza and the remaining watchers the irrevocable sentence: imprisonment in the abyss for countless generations, awaiting the final judgment. And Uriel descended to Noah, warned him of what was coming, told him to build an ark. This is the point, rarely noticed by modern readers, at which the Enochian tradition intertwines with stunning precision with the account in Genesis. The two narratives, read side by side, fit together. The flood was not an abstract response to a generically sinful humanity. It was a surgical response to a contaminated one. And the primary target of that response, before even the corrupted men, were the Nephilim, the hybrid lineage, the giants born of the transgression of the Watchers. The earth needed to be cleansed, and it was. But then, centuries later, when Moses assembled the sacred manuscripts, when the spies crossed the Jordan and returned in terror, when the armies of Israel approached Canaan for the taking of the promised land, the biblical narrative delivers the most disturbing confession in this entire story. The giants had not been eradicated by the flood. They were there, alive, standing, waiting on the other side of the river, the account in Numbers. Chapter 13 is dry, direct, and for that very reason terrifying. The 12 men sent by Moses traversed the land for 40 days. They returned carrying clusters of grapes so heavy it took 2 men to carry them, suspended on poles between their shoulders, and they brought back, alongside the fruit, a report that made the hearts of the people melt inside their chests. There were men in the land of Canaan of superhuman stature, the Anakim, sons of Anak, direct descendants of the Nephilim, so enormous in the words of the spies themselves that beside them the Israelites felt like grasshoppers, and in the eyes of the giants they appeared in truth like grasshoppers about to be crushed. It was not rhetorical exaggeration from cowardly men. It was a military assessment, so much so that the terror of the spies infected the entire people, provoked rebellion against Moses, delayed the entry into the promised land by 40 years, and condemned an entire generation to die in the desert without ever witnessing the fulfillment of the promise. An entire generation buried in the sand because of what it had seen on the other side of the river. And what it had seen on the other side of the river had a name: Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zuzim, Avim. Different branches of the same ancient trunk, scattered through Canaan, through Bashan, through Moab, across the entire belt of land the Hebrews would need to cross to inherit the promise made to Abraham. The presence of these giant races, attested by the biblical writers themselves without the slightest embarrassment, revealed something that later theology would desperately try to dissolve. The lineage of the Nephilim, which should have been extinguished by the waters, had survived. Somehow, somewhere, by some path the sacred text does not fully make explicit, they had continued. They continued in Hebron, where the sons of Anak reigned. They continued in Bashan, where Og reigned. They continued in Gath, in Ashdod, in Ashkelon, Philistine strongholds where, centuries later, a certain shepherd would still be found challenging a certain giant named Goliath before the armies of Israel. The story, which seemed to have ended in the days of Noah, was only beginning to unfold. Bashan, north of the Jordan, fertile land, mountainous, cut through by plains where the wheat grew tall and the cattle multiplied. And over all that region there reigned a man, if man he could still be called, whose very name sent tremors through the courts of the petty kingdoms around him, Og, king of Bashan, last of the Rephaim. So the book of Deuteronomy itself described him in the 3rd chapter with the cold precision of someone recording an administrative fact, last of the Rephaim. Survivor, remnant, a shard of a race that should have disappeared beneath the waters of the flood, and that, against all logic, still walked the earth, still governed cities, still commanded armies. And the detail the biblical writer added next is the kind that stops the attentive reader cold. His bed was of iron. It was kept in Rabbah, capital of the Ammonites, as material, almost museological, proof of his existence. It measured 9 cubits in length by 4 cubits in width, the equivalent of more than 4 meters by nearly 2 meters. It was not a man's bed. It was a catafalque cast in the hardest metal that world had ever known, because no wood would have borne the weight of that body. Moses faced Og at Edrei. The Hebrews prevailed, according to the account, only because the divine voice itself assured Moses that Og would be delivered into his hands. Without that assurance, the army fresh from the desert would have fled in panic, as decades earlier the 12 spies had fled before the sons of Anak. But Bashan fell, and Hebron fell. And gradually, city by city, fortress by fortress, Joshua came down upon the Anakim like a prolonged storm and cut that ancient lineage as one prunes a cursed tree, almost entirely. Not entirely, because some escaped. The book of Joshua itself records in chapter 11 that of the Anakim there remained survivors in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. 3 Philistine strongholds, 3 pockets on the coastal plain where the old race still breathed, still bore children, still waited for its moment. And time would work in their favor. Centuries later, in the reign of Saul, when Israel had become a nation and marched in formation against the armies of the coastland, it was from Gath precisely that the last celebrated giant of the Hebrew Bible emerged. He came out armored in bronze. He came out standing, according to the text, 6 cubits and a span, which in modern measurements approaches nearly 3 meters in height. He came out carrying a spear, whose iron tip alone weighed more than the full equipment of many Israelite soldiers, Goliath of Gath. Direct descendant of that same race the spies had seen on the other side of the Jordan, blood of the Anakim, flesh of the Rephaim, living echo of the Nephilim. And there he stood in the valley of Elah, defying the armies of the living God, morning and evening for 40 days, certain that no mortal would have the courage to face him, until a shepherd came down from the hill with 5 stones. The stone that struck Goliath's forehead did not bring down merely a warrior, it brought down the last visible symbol of a lineage that had crossed the flood, survived the conquest of Canaan, hidden itself within the Philistine strongholds, and considered itself immortal. It brought down the pride of the Watchers. It brought down the ancient echo of the celestial rebellion on Hermon. And even so, even after that fall, the matter did not close. Because the Bible, read with attention, does not shut the chapter of the giants. It simply stops speaking of them. The later texts, prophets, psalmists, chroniclers, treat the Rephaim as shadows descending into Sheol, as ancient spirits lying in the depths, as names spoken only in whispers. Isaiah mentions them, Ezekiel mentions them, the book of Psalms mentions them, always on the border between the remembered and the forgotten, always as the outline of something that existed, was feared, was overcome and whose memory needed to be embalmed with care. And it was precisely there that the Church, centuries later, made its choice. The early Church Fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athenagoras, embraced without hesitation the ancient reading. For them, the sons of God were fallen angels. The Nephilim were the hybrids born of that union, and the demons that tormented men were nothing other than the disembodied spirits of those giants who had died in the flood. It was the majority interpretation. It was the interpretation of the early centuries. But time passed. The empire embraced the faith. Theology became imperial. And when Augustine of Hippo, in the 5th century, sat down to write his monumental City of God, he chose, with the full weight of his authority, to shift the interpretation. The sons of God became, in his argument, the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men, the descendants of Cain. A corrupted lineage mingled with a faithful one. A human mixture, all too human. The Nephilim became great men, valiant men, nothing more. The Book of Enoch was quietly excluded from the Western canon. The Enochian traditions were pushed to the margins, preserved only by the Ethiopian Church. In a language that few Europeans could read, the operation was discreet but effective. Within a generation, the Watchers had vanished from sermons. Within 2, the Nephilim had become allegory. Within 5, most of the faithful did not even know that account existed in Genesis 6. The text remained there, printed, read aloud in churches, but wrapped in such a dense explanatory fog that no one could see any longer what it actually said. And perhaps it is precisely that which still today fascinates and unsettles anyone who stumbles by chance upon those 3 verses. Because the story of the Nephilim does not ask for blind belief. It asks for attention. It asks for the courage to reread what has always been lying open on the table. It asks for the willingness to look at the colossal bones that ancient travelers claim to have found in Canaan, at the vast tombs of Hebron, at the Cyclopean walls of Bashan still visible in the hills of the Golan, and to admit that something someday walked across that land with a stride that made the ground tremble. The identity of the Nephilim remains to this day a stubborn unknown. For some, they were literally the sons of rebellious celestial beings. For others, the mythic memory of forgotten prehistoric peoples, colossal not in height, but in power, in cruelty, in dominion. For still others, the way ancient humanity wrapped in sacred language the inexplicable terror of finding in the valleys something it could not name. Each reader answers from wherever they stand. And perhaps the persistence of this story, centuries after so many attempts to erase it, says more about the human heart than it does about the giants themselves. There is, in each of us, the same restlessness that moved Enoch to write, that moved Moses to record, that moved David to gather 5 stones from the brook. The silent unease that perhaps the world is larger, older, and stranger than anyone dares admit aloud. And it is for that reason that those 3 verses still unsettle. Because as long as there is a book lying open upon the table, as long as there is someone willing to read with new eyes, the story of the Nephilim will remain open, not as an archaeological curiosity, as a mirror, as a silent provocation to the one who reads and recognizes, somewhere in the depths of their own soul, an equal smallness before what surpasses them, an equal temptation toward what they should not touch, an equal capacity to generate, through their own choices, giants that will one day walk again across their own land. The lineage was cut, the bodies were buried, the cities were brought down, the mountains returned their secrets to the vultures and the wind. But the echo remained, because there are stories that time cannot silence, no matter how fiercely theology, empire, and forgetting conspire together. The name of the Nephilim survived. It crossed the flood. It crossed the conquest, it crossed the exile, it crossed the canon, it crossed the Christian centuries, the medieval, the modern. And it arrives at this very moment, still vibrating in anyone who pauses before that ancient phrase and feels, even without knowing why, a chill descend along their spine. As long as men walk upon the earth, there will always be someone who returns to Genesis 6. There will be someone who returns to the book of Enoch. There will be someone who, with a lamp in hand and a tightening in the chest, will slowly reread every line of that forgotten account, and will hear, coming from very far away, from the mountains of Hermon, from the ruins of Bashan, from the sands of Gath, the same hoarse, ancient, unspeakable echo that 1,000 ecclesiastical silences never managed to extinguish, and that will continue to resound across the centuries, for as long as there remains upon the face of the earth a single soul capable of lifting their eyes to the sky and trembling. Attention!
There is a truth sealed by God for millennia, hidden until the end of times. It's no coincidence you are here. The signs are everywhere, and few are ready for this revelation. If you've ever felt that restlessness, that there's something deeper in the scriptures, this book is your key. But know this is the time. And the vault of the chosen reveals what God sealed for you. Within it, the 7 seals unveil the truth about being a chosen one and the eternal impact of this revelation. And the proof is here. Look how many minds are freed. Yours could be next. Secure your access now. Click the link in the comments or description and unveil these truths.